Hi, I'm Kip Kendrick, Boone County Presiding Commissioner. We want to thank you for joining us this evening on the master planning process. The Boone County Commission appreciates your participation throughout. It's been over 25 years since we've completed a master planning process. And it's critical that we get public input throughout. We don't want Boone County government to lead this process. We really want this to be community driven and make sure that we have broad representation throughout Boone County to really guide us on how we view land use for the next 10 to 20 years down the road, and how we help guide growth and what we really want Boone County to be like 15, 20, 30 years down the road. So we're still very much early on in this process. This will go on throughout really 2024. There's a survey that's out there currently that will be available through the end of September. We encourage you to take that survey and share it with all your friends, family who live and or work in Boone County for their participation in it as well. And thank you again for participating. If you have questions, make sure to reach out to us. When we very much appreciate the I-5 group's participation and help with this process. It's going to be critical as we continue to see Boone County grow. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Thanks for joining us this evening for our first virtual open house for the Boone County Master Plan. My name is Stephen Eibendahl. I'm the principal of the I-5 group and project manager for our planning team, working with Boone County and putting together the new master plan. Thanks again for joining us this evening. I know it's on a beautiful September evening. Not always wanting to be inside watching a video, so we do appreciate your time in terms of learning more about the Boone County master plan. We'll go ahead and just jump right in to the open house and the virtual meeting and the presentation. If you've registered and on this webinar, you've been to our website, ourboone.com. But if you know others who may be interested in the planning process and in the plan, please have them visit the plan website, ourboone.com. The website is the hub for communications for the overall planning process. There you can sign up for e-newsletters, e-blasts. As we move through the planning process, there'll be documents, information about upcoming events, and also recording of tonight's webinar will be posted on the website later this week. And traditionally, we found that the recordings of these webinars, of these virtual meetings, tend to get more traction than sometimes the live event itself, that folks can view the videos on their own time and kind of can watch at their leisure and fast forward and still get kind of the overall gist of the meeting. And we've had good exposure to the website to date. That we've launched the website just this past spring, and we've had almost 3,000 visitors to the website already. So good awareness early on in the planning process of the website and the overall plan. Our agenda tonight for the webinar, really kind of two main things we want to cover with tonight's presentation is give you a little bit of an overview of the overall planning process, why the master plan is being updated, give you a little bit of kind of the overall schedule to the plan, and also talk about community engagement, public engagement, what that we've done to date and throughout the process. And then the second half of the presentation will be highlighting existing conditions in terms of we'll bring together an existing conditions report right now. So members of the team will be highlighting some different data points and maps later on in the presentation. And then we'll end with a little bit of the upcoming schedule. A couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions as we move through the presentation, feel free to put those into the Q&A button you should be able to see on your screen. Type those in. We'll save answering those until the end, but feel free to type those in anytime during the presentation. And again, we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. So we've got a great planning team working with us in terms of developing the master plan. And these are some of the folks you'll be seeing tonight on the presentation. They'll introduce themselves a little bit later on when they kind of talk to their specific areas of focus and talking about some of the data that we'll be showing tonight. And then some other members of the team, both on the call tonight and also a little bit more behind the scenes, especially if you come to the first open house or open houses down the road, you may see some of these additional team members. So we're excited to have a welcome by Presiding Commissioner Kip Kendrick. Kip is actually live in Centralia. The county is hosting 2 viewing sessions of tonight's webinar. And so Kip is hosting one in Centralia, and then Commissioner Justin Aldridge is hosting one in Ashland. So instead of trying to change over to a live feed in Centralia, we have a pre-recorded welcome from Kip. And we got some comments about, I apologize, we had some, I guess, audio difficulties here with the sound on our system. So we'll be posting that separate video too when we post the overall presentation. I apologize in terms of that audio not working. So we'll just go ahead and move on. And again, we'll post Kip's welcome as when we post the overall video. So what is a master plan, and why is the county updating the master plan? Well, the county has an existing master plan. The current plan is over 25 years old. And the plan is being used now in terms of it is a guide for rezoning requests, conditional use permits, other land use regulations. And it's important to remember that the plan itself is a policy document. It's not by itself a regulatory document, but does help guide updating things like zoning, development regulations, et cetera. So with the plan being 25 years old, the county has changed a lot over the last 25 years. A lot of population growth, a lot of job growth. So it's important the county has an up-to-date land use plan. And it's also important to remember the jurisdiction of the plan will be for the unincorporated areas of the county. So if you live in Columbia, if you live in Ashland, if you live in Centralia or other cities in the county, your land use in terms of future land use plan, in terms of zoning, is regulated by those cities. Now that being said, as you'll see in terms of members of our advisory committee, as folks who want to take the survey, we're also getting participation by the cities. Obviously, as the cities grow, they're impacting unincorporated areas. There's also in terms of coordinating services between unincorporated areas and cities. So coordinating with the cities is an important part of this process. And then we're also wanting to get input from folks who live in the cities too, even though the jurisdiction of the plan, again, will be for the unincorporated areas. In many ways, a master plan is also a strategic guide. We'll be examining things like demographics, the jobs, housing, mobility. and we're coordinating not only with the communities, but different agencies, groups like the Missouri Department of Transportation, different utilities, different organizations on future growth in the county. So this process is a chance to get a wide spectrum of folks together and really talk about the future in the county. And then finally, developing a shared community vision. That's a chance, through this process to sort of get some consensus on not only a vision, but also priorities in the county. So in many ways, we're still very early on in this planning process that we'll be really working through the end of next year, the end of 2024 through this work. And it really kicked off here just this past spring. It's really 4 main phases of the overall planning process that you see on your screen now. We're in this first phase called existing conditions and discovery. Again, kind of kicked off this spring. We'll be kind of wrapping up this first phase in this fall with our first deliverable that'll kind of document existing conditions, also document what we've heard through the survey and through our initial engagement. And then as we do each phase of the work, moving forward, we'll have a different community event to kind of end each phase of the work. And then in the fall of next year, doing formal public hearings as it kind of goes through the final adoption process. So the phase we're in now, existing conditions and discovery, really 2 concurrent phases. That one is we're doing community engagement throughout the process through the end of next year, but especially in this first phase, doing a lot of listening. And we're presenting that information tonight and in our existing conditions report, but especially early on, especially with the survey, we're trying to do a lot of listening in terms of identifying key issues, identifying again challenges, but also kind of a vision of residents. And then concurrently with that, looking at existing conditions, pulling together existing data, maps, analysis, et cetera, and pulling that together. So kind of walk you through in terms of those 2 elements. So starting with kind of the community engagement side, one of the key parts is the advisory and technical committees that were formed for the planning process. So 2 committees. I'll start with a technical committee. As the name implies, more of a technical focus in terms of representation. So representation from, again, agencies like the Missouri Department of Transportation, different utilities that service the county, fire protection districts, different county departments. I'll look a little bit more of a focus on, again, kind of the services and utilities that service the county. And then on the other side is the advisory committee. Goal was to kind of keep around 20 members. I think we may be about 24 members right now, and trying to get a little bit of a challenge in terms of how do you get broad representation from across the county and about 20 members. So you see there on the screen in terms of the different representation that we have on the advisory committee in terms of representatives from the county's Planning and Zoning Commission, representatives from the 3 largest communities, different organizations like Farm Bureau, realtors, major employers, nonprofits, watershed interests. So trying to get a broad representation in about 20 members. Both groups are ad hoc committees, kind of meeting organized specifically just kind of for this purpose temporarily for the planning process, and then meeting about 5 to 8 times, through the planning process. We've already had 2 meetings with both committees to date. And if you're interested in knowing the makeup of each committee, the membership list and most of the bios are on the Our Boone website. And if you're also interested in learning more about the planning team members that you're hearing from tonight, our bios are on the ourboone.com website. I mentioned listening. Back in July, we had a series of stakeholder listening sessions throughout the county. These were small groups, sometimes one-on-one meetings throughout the county. Spent about 3.5 days of different meetings. Started in Harrisburg, went to Ashland, Columbia, and Centralia. These were back in mid-July. So a chance for us as a planning team to really, again, spend a lot of time listening, identifying key issues, kind of asking about thoughts on the future. And the makeup of those meetings, we ended up having 24 of these small group listening sessions over the 3.5 days, 80 plus attendees. And you see there some of the groups, some different representation that we met with over those days. And again, our focus was, some of the groups that weren't represented on the advisory or technical committees already. So that was a lot of our priority focus in terms of getting folks to those small group listening sessions. And we especially use a lot of that, what we heard, to help shape the current survey that is ongoing. Here we are in September. We're having our first round of open houses. We're doing a virtual open house, which is happening right now here online. Then we'll be having a in-person open house in 2 weeks on September 26th on a Tuesday, 4:30 to 7 p.m. The meeting will be at Boone Electric Cooperative. There's no formal presentation, so feel free to drop by anytime between 4:30 and 7 p.m. And part of tonight too is also with the webinar, and then also the recorded version is that as folks attend in person, they can watch this webinar to get a little bit more updated with kind of details about some of the information before they come to the in-person information in terms of asking us questions from the planning team or having a discussion with the team. I mentioned the survey. The survey is ongoing. Hopefully, if you're on this webinar, you've probably taken the survey. But if you haven't, please do. Also encourage your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, your networks to take the survey. The survey will be open until September 30th. It kicked off in early August. It's primarily an online survey, but we're also have done a mailed paper survey. The mailed paper survey went out in late August. We're starting to get those rolling in. The mailed survey went out to 2,100 random households targeting unincorporated areas of the county. So we wanted to make sure with the paper survey, that we get good geographic distribution representation with the survey. So again, help us spread the word about the survey. Again, it'll be open until the end of this month. And if you have taken the survey, hopefully also utilize the mapping tool that's part of the survey. So with the mapping tool, you can make location-specific comments on a map of Boone County. So let's highlight some of the existing conditions, some of the public engagement that we've done to date, and again, really promoting the survey at this point. Next phase of the presentation of the webinar, I want to show some highlights of the existing conditions that we've pulled together. As you look at this data, a few things to keep in mind. We've been trying to pull together not only a snapshot of existing conditions, but also trends over the last 2 decades, roughly 20 years. Again, the county has grown a lot over the last 2 decades, or really since the last plan was adopted. So we want to try to show folks in terms of some of those different trends of growth over the last 20 years, where we can, and also sometimes comparing Boone County to some of your neighbors or some of the statewide data sets. Again, where we can. Sometimes the data does not easily allow itself to be compared or have comparisons for 20 years. There's always new data being developed, and sometimes there's not historical precedents to compare it to. And just a few other kind of notes about data. It changes over time. One of the challenges it's always moving target in terms of collecting data. Obviously, census data changes on a yearly basis. The different agencies we pull data from is a way of collecting new data. So sometimes, again, it's a moving target. And then different sources sometimes measure things either slightly differently or have kind of different categorization of the data. So kind of take some of these things with a grain of salt in terms of looking at some of the overall trends as opposed to maybe the details of a certain data point. And then some of the sources of data don't always align with the same time frame. So again, as we kind of go through the slides, we're trying to show things again roughly the last 2 decades, but things don't perfectly align. Sometimes we'll be looking at 2000 compared to 2020, but sometimes looking at 2019 versus earlier time frame. So roughly 2 decades, but it doesn't always align perfectly with the same time frame. It's also important to keep in mind the level of detail. Boone County is a big county. So sometimes, again, we have to be careful in terms of how far we can go down any particular topic in terms of level of detail with the size of the county that Boone is. And then we've also tried, again, where we can, to really kind of pull out data countywide and compare it to unincorporated areas versus the cities, kind of comparing that difference. Again, some of the data is easily extracted looking at unincorporated areas versus cities. Sometimes it's not, and sometimes we've had to make approximations. So we always try to be transparent in terms of some of the nuances in the data as we move forward. And again, it's a lot of these things are still in progress. Even when we issue our existing conditions report this fall, if we collect new data, things are updated that we can incorporate as we move through the process again next year. We still maybe kind of be adding on kind of some of the data that we've collected to date. So keep these things in mind as we kind of go through some of the data tonight, and then as you look at the existing conditions report later this fall. So we'll be highlighting tonight kind of information in these six categories. And then we'll come back on at the end and kind of walk you through next steps. And again, leave some time if folks have questions. So I'm going to be turning over to, before I turn it over, this slide is kind of, again, a little bit of a preview of some of the things we'll see in the other slides, a little bit of a teaser, if you will, some countywide trends over the last 2 decades. As we get further into the presentation, further into the slides, we'll start talking about some of the nuances with these data points. And again, some of these things are impacted more in different areas of the county. But just a little bit of a teaser in terms of overall development in the county, in terms of developed land cover, the kind of layer on the left. And there's different types of land cover, from high intensity development, which is kind of more of, say, you have streets, a lot of pavement, right? Streets, parking, a lot of pavement, et cetera, down to lower intensity development, which is more like single family homes at different densities, et cetera, and even developed open space, which is like perhaps residential common ground, et cetera. So kind of different categories of development. So all those categories together have grown about 17% in the county the last 2 decades. Deciduous forest, a little foreshadowing here. Deciduous forest is your top #1 land cover in terms of area in the county. But overall, the amount of deciduous forest land cover has dropped by about 1% over the last 2 decades. Population countywide grown about 34%, as we'll see in the slides. Obviously, different areas of the county has grown differently than others. Jobs in the county have grown, again, depending on some of the data that you look at, about 30%, between 25 and 31% in the county. And then transportation, and these are kind of based on kind of individual corridors, and again, kind of the range of corridors. But the corridors that we've been looking at, about 8 to 30, 30+%, again, in different areas of the county. So a little bit of a teaser as we kind of move through these categories and kind of get into the details. So now I'm going to turn it over to Bob Lewis, let him introduce himself, tell a little bit about his background, and get into this discussion of population changes.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Again, Bob Lewis. Presently I teach urban planning at St. Louis University. Been doing that for 5 years. I spent 42 years as a practicing city planner and economic development, mostly of that in consulting. So this is the kind of work I'm used to, and most of that related to things you're going to see here, population numbers, housing growth, economic development, and so forth. So that's where I'm coming from on these existing conditions and trend lines. The first slide here simply shows that of the 115 counties that Missouri has, Boone County is the 8th largest. That's, nobody's as big as St. Louis County in terms of population, or Jackson County. But Boone County is big relatively. You're going to see in a second here that it's been growing very fast. Most of that population, however, is concentrated, as you can see, kind of right there in the middle. I wonder what city that is. So that's we're going to see a lot of that influence of Columbia as we go through these slides. Stephen, are you shifting? Or is that me? There we go. Long-term population trends in the county. The data goes back there to 1940, just to be a long-term picture. Stephen has, of course, told us to pay a lot of attention to that 2000, 2020 range. But you can see both Columbia and Boone have been growing rather strongly, since right before World War II. These are comparing growth rates, not numbers of people. The rest of the county really didn't start growing until about 1970, and we think that's because about that point, the county adopted zoning. The unincorporated part of the county adopted zoning. Zoning is a very strong tool to essentially reduce risk if you're going to invest in real estate in anywhere in a city or a county. If you do so, where you don't have zoning, you run the risk of somebody going to put a land use next to you that's incompatible with you. And there are not a whole lot of rules. But there about 1970s, Boone County did so and removed a lot of the risk for investing, buying insurance and so forth. So it really took off. You can see it's sluggish in the last couple of decades relative to the rest of the Columbia. Really, it's driving Boone County. We'll see that on the next slide. I think it's the next one. Yeah. Here we've got comparing 2000 population to 2021, 21 years here. That's green and blue. Boone County as a whole on the left, also about 182,000 more today. Because it's 2023 now in Fulton County, but roughly 85% of that's in Columbia. Columbia dominates both because it grows itself with people, but also geographically. So the rest of the unincorporated county, as we count it today, they had about 43,000 residents in 2000, and now about almost 45.5, probably a little more today. That increase of on the order of 2,500 people probably means an addition of about 800 to 1,000 housing units. We're still working on getting those counts. So we're adding housing throughout the unincorporated part, let alone in the cities themselves. Let's look at the city populations next here. This is just a graphic of that 2000 to 2021, looking primarily at the various incorporated cities in the county. Over to the left is the full county. That's the 34% growth that Stephen showed you earlier on that dashboard. The unincorporated area, however, has grown only 6%. Columbia, of course, has grown 47%. Ashland, very rapid growth rate, but Ashland, and as you can see with Hallsville, and really all the other cities other than Columbia are relatively small. So a few people added gives you a high growth rate. But it's pretty impressive, actually, that Ashland and Hallsville have had that much popularity in the last couple of decades, pretending there's room for growth, maybe an interesting growth as well. Overall, all the cities combined over those 2 decades have grown 48%. So you can see the power of Columbia in all of that. The rest of the cities really couldn't overcome that. Missouri, on the other hand, just grew 10%. So, we're doing really good here in Boone County if you like more people. Cole County to your south, which is of course also a strong economy based around state government, is just grew only 8%. So the place to be right now, if you like more people coming and making new friends, is in Boone County. Next slide. Somewhere. There we go. And a quick graphic on kind of where that population change has happened. This is the whole county by census tract, and then that population change by census tract. A little hard to read if you've got a small screen like I do, but it's easy enough. Notably, only 2 little tiny census tracts have lost population of any significance. Those are the red ones. A little bit on the kind of the pink color there. Those are in the city of Columbia or right next to it. Some declines there for any number of reasons, more other kinds of development, a little urban decline and so forth. But the highest growth, the purple components, purple tracts, there on on the north side of Columbia and the south side. So you see the city and its edges expanding as subdivisions get built and shopping centers, and it starts to accommodate more and more population there in the center of the county. But overall, the overall county has grown very well. There's a lot of growth in a lot of places, as we saw with these city comparisons, as well as here on the census tract. And as you'll see in a few minutes, Stephen's going to tell you that there's a lot of room for further growth if you take down some trees. But let's move on. So moving to a little illustration on the economy as of 2020, data for how many jobs there are by major economic sectors. Those sectors are there on the graph or on the left. Your biggest job sector is healthcare. Not surprising, kind of not surprising, because of the major medical facilities you have in the area, as well as Columbia serving as a pretty significant regional medical center, lowercase c, even for mid-Missouri. Educational services, of course, is a big employer as well, but doesn't outnumber medical or the healthcare and social assistance side of things. We're going to see a little bit different interpretation in the middle of that, but educational services, not surprising, given particularly the higher education institutions that Columbia has and Boone County as a whole. And then retail trade, big because of a lot of people that are buying stuff, good buying power, good incomes in Boone County, particularly in Columbia, and a little bit of a aside on that with regarding students. They don't have a whole lot of income, but they do have buying power because of mom and dad more than anything else. And then so retail trade strong. Also, Columbia serves, because it's on I-70 and other major roads, as a retail center for mid-Missouri. Stephen, next slide. And then a little on the left there, let's start there, a little more interpretation of the jobs thing. This shows what we call location quotients. This is taking the same economic sectors, subsectors that you see there, and figuring out what percentage each of those has in jobs of the total number of jobs in Boone County, and then dividing it by the same percentage, by the same methodology, with, in this case, comparing it to the state of Missouri. So if you have a sector that has a ratio of 1, which is that red line, and look at retail trade, for example, it's right at about 1. That means that Boone County and the state of Missouri have the same percentage of jobs in retail trade, divided by the entire the amount of jobs in the jurisdiction. Educational services, though, you note, creates a very high location quotient for Boone County, more so than the healthcare. So the healthcare, which is right below that, still a positive number. That means it's an export sector. It's bringing in new money, but with a lot more jobs than are in the educational services sector. Clearly, educational services shouldn't be a shock to anybody. Is bringing in a lot of new money, creating a lot of jobs, much more forcefully than the state economy as a whole, which tends to be more average on things. You're also doing well with in the sectors like management of enterprises. Those are basically places that run other businesses or parts of business, like headquarters, corporate headquarters, regional headquarters, that sort of thing. Not a bad thing. You've got right in the middle of the state, makes a lot of sense. And that relates also to finance and insurance. There's a lot of brain power also going on, brain power kinds of jobs here. If you look up higher, manufacturing, for example, or wholesale trade, which are not so much brain power, important, but they're not important, relatively important in Boone County like they are in many others. And then on the right, just to give you a sense of scale again, this is the number of jobs in yellow as in Columbia for each of the sectors. And the blue bars are all the jobs in the rest of the county. So it's again illustrating how much Columbia dominates both the population as well as the economy of Boone County. Should it be? Can we do something about that? It's another question. That's part of the planning process. Stephen? And then a little quick, we got on all those things we just showed you, we have a lot more data, a lot more maps, stuff to analyze as we get into the next phases of the planning process. But also interesting to look at is where these jobs are located, which maps we've got data. We've got retail trade there on the left, pretty much, pardon me, concentrated in Columbia, right in the middle, just like we kind of would expect, but also trailing out to the sides a little bit along I-70. And then you can also see in many of these other cities where they're located, you got pretty significant retail jobs. Makes sense. That's where the buying power is, especially when we all go home after working. Manufacturing, not a big component of the economy, but they also tend to be there. Well, they're kind of in that I-70 corridor, which makes a lot of sense since I-70 is almost a coast-to-coast highway for the United States, and a good distribution capability, both for bringing in materials as well as sending out finished products. And then up in the Northeast, a pretty good concentration of manufacturing jobs up there as well. Construction is another kind of animal. So construction firms and their jobs are located pretty much throughout the county, which is kind of impressive. Construction firms tend to be like small contractors as well as larger ones, and they do spread out. And they many times they're made up of, especially the subcontracting business, made up of very small firms that work out of somebody's home, somebody's garage, and so forth. This doesn't mean where the construction is actually happening, by the way. This is where the construction firms are based, and but they're more spread out, suggesting, of course, that there's room for some other dispersal of other kinds of economic sectors as well. Stephen, I think we're moving on to economic development stuff, which is not my department. At least not today.
Thanks, Bob. Good evening, everybody. I'm Beth Noonan with Community and Economic Development Solutions.
And I'm Jackie Wellington, also with Community and Economic Development Solutions.
So Jackie and I, just a little bit about us. We have a background actually as practitioners in economic development. We both worked for the St. Louis County Economic Development Agency for many, many years, and then are now in doing consulting in both economic and community development. Our role in this project is really to look at, to complete the economic development analysis and then develop recommendations based on best practices in economic development. What that means is that we're going to be looking at all of the demographic data that's being collected, it's in the process of being collected, participating and talking with community stakeholders about economic development, community development challenges and opportunities that they see, and then also reviewing existing studies that you've had in the past, as well as your current economic development strategies that are in place and are being implemented. So we'll take all that information and really look to develop best practice, based on best practices, recommendations on how the county can grow its economic base. And our goal here is really to augment what is existing and what's in place. And so our role is really to see what are the opportunities that haven't been identified and how can you take advantage and leverage those. We'll also use that data and our understanding of economic development activities to see how the trends that we're seeing would potentially shape the future growth scenarios. So that's really going to be our role. We'll have a few more slides in upcoming sessions. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Beth. These next few slides, we'll sort of look at some of the changes in land cover in the county over the last couple of decades, and then also looking at these also kind of start to show some of the development patterns in terms of how the county's grown over the last, again, about 20 years. So what you're looking at on your screen now is land cover in the county, and this is based on the latest data, which is from 2019. And as I mentioned earlier, the foreshadowing, deciduous forest areas in green there on the map is your top land cover countywide. About 34% of the county is is considered a deciduous forest. And then the number 2, a pasture hay, which is kind of both your traditional pasture, but also could be more kind of lawn type areas kind of fall under that a lot of times. And then cultivated crops, number 3, at about 16%. So about 12% of the county is considered developed. And again, as I mentioned earlier, some different categories of developed, from high intensity down to a lower intensity. About 12% of the county is considered developed. And now that if you exclude the cities, so if you exclude Columbia, if you exclude Ashland, Centralia, the other communities, about 6% of unincorporated areas is developed. Now, if we start to look at the changes over the last 20 years, the 2 graphs on the screen now, on the left is a change in land cover in unincorporated areas over the last about 20 years, from 2001 to 2019. And again, we're looking at kind of based on acres, number of acres. So there's been a gain in cultivated crops, a loss in pasture hay. Again, a loss of deciduous forest, about 400 plus acres. And then developed areas and unincorporated areas have grown by about 5% since 2001. So about a 5% increase in developed land cover. Then on the right, it kind of compares it then to the city of Columbia, and this is based on the city's current boundary. So developed areas in the city has grown by about 30% since 2001. And then you look there in terms of loss of pasture and loss of deciduous forest. So actually, more acreage has been lost kind of in the Columbia, within Columbia, than county unincorporated areas of the county. But you look at these numbers in terms of development growth, in terms of development areas, 30% in Columbia, 5% in unincorporated areas, and you compare them to the population growth in those areas. So countywide, unincorporated areas have grown by about 6% from one of Bob's previous slides. Columbia, I believe, I don't have the number right in front of me, but actually, if you look at population growth, and especially with the job growth that's happened in the last 20 years, the amount of development area it doesn't exceed that. Actually, the county and Columbia has grown fairly smartly over the last 20 years. You compare that to other regions. The St. Louis region, sometimes you might hear in the news that we've been a slow population growth area, but then our developed areas have actually grown quite a bit. So we've actually had areas that kind of hollowed out, and our population as a region has stayed relatively stagnant, but then our developed areas has continued to grow. So that's when you kind of make sure you kind of get those conditions of sprawl. But to date, the county and Columbia, your developed areas have not exceeded your population growth, at least to date. This next slide, we've taken all those 4 kind of classifications of development, from high intensity down to low intensity and open space, and combined them as one color, kind of the orange color you see on the screen, a little hard to see. So this shows the changes in development countywide, again, since 2001. It's all shown as the orange. And so you see a lot of that is focused on the edges of Columbia. You see a little bit there in Ashland, a little bit there in Hallsville and Centralia. But then just looking at the map, you don't see that much in terms of some of the unincorporated areas. A little hard to see in terms of the residential development that's happened in those areas, because it would just show up as just a little dot in terms of a road or a house in those areas. So you see kind of the large areas of development are pretty easy to see in this map, but doesn't quite show some of the rural residential that's happened over time. So we looked at, and then in terms of looking at that rural residential development, starting to look at especially some of the larger rural residential. So we looked at rural residential that are firm on properties, on parcels of 2 to 20 acres. So kind of give you a sense of scale of what that looks like. So the photos on your screen now on the upper left are houses on about 2 to 3 acres, and then on the bottom right there, houses on 13 to 17 acres, so getting close to that 20-acre size. Kind of gives you a sense of scale. So again, you're looking at if you look at a land cover kind of graphic of that, again, most of that would be deciduous forest, kind of grassland, but with a small dot for the house. But this rural residential has kind of been an important kind of a key development trend, especially in the unincorporated areas, these larger rural residential parcels. So these two maps, so the map on the left, and this is based on 2023 data. So the areas you see in red are those residential parcels, 2 to 20 acres that I mentioned. So all the areas you see in red are existing residential parcels of that larger size, 2 to 20 acres. And then the map on the right is the change in those parcels in terms of basically new parcels. And again, the time frame here is about the last 10 years, so basically since 2012, so a shorter time frame. So in terms of here, we've had an increase in terms of number of parcels, about 16% increase over the last decade or so, and about 18% increase in total acreage, again, of these rural residential parcels of 2 to 20 acres. And we also did a little bit deeper dive in terms of looking at the changes closer to existing city limits. We looked at within a mile-and-a-half boundary of Columbia, Ashland, Hallsville, and Centralia, and that's the area you see on the map on the right. The area in yellow is mile-and-a-half boundary from existing city limits. So we looked at, again, kind of the change over the last about decade in these rural residential parcels of 2 to 20 acres. So there you see on the left, in terms of the top is change in acres, and the bottom change in the number of parcels. So Hallsville's had a marked increase, 37%, 38% respectively, in terms of growth of these larger residential parcels. Ashland, and then Centralia. So again, it's kind of one of the things, again, we're trying to kind of show and document some of these recent trends over the last decade to 2 decades throughout the county. And I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to talk about transportation.
Great. Well, thanks, Stephen. My name's Kevin Neal. I'm a senior planner with Lockmuller Group. We're a civil engineering firm with a strong focus in transportation planning and traffic engineering. So our role on the project is really to dig into existing conditions, recent trends in transportation, and help make sure that the system's functioning safely, efficiently, and is going to meet future growth throughout the county. So today I'm just going to highlight a few of the items that we're looking at. We're still in the process of collecting and analyzing some additional data with the transportation system. We have a lot of partners in addition to Boone County, like MoDOT and municipal public works and streets departments that also contribute to this interconnected transportation system. So let's go ahead and dig right in. So just a few characteristics we'd like to cover, just to give you some context for some of the items we'll be looking at. The first of these is functional classification, which is like a hierarchy for how we understand the function of each road within the transportation network. So on the one end, you have arterials like interstate highways, major state routes, and other larger roadways, really focused on mobility, getting people from one place to another. At the other end of the spectrum, we have our local roads. These are neighborhood streets, county roads in rural areas, really linking people to their final destination. So think of these roads as more focused on access and greater means of entry. When we look at our functional classification map, you can kind of see how this web of interconnected streets functions. One of the important things to keep in mind with regard to functional classification is its importance as it relates to federal funding eligibility. So roads that are functionally classified, all those roads that show up as a colored roads here, so our blue, red, purple, etc., these are eligible for a wider variety of federal funds and can really take advantage of those resources available. And this functional classification system changes over time as new growth and development occurs. Roads can be reclassified as their function changes. Next slide. Another item we've been looking at is how these roads are utilized. Looking at traffic volumes, kind of from a historical perspective, we've identified kind of some trends over time to see how these roadways respond to growth throughout the county. We've picked a handful of locations just to get a sense of how things have changed in the last 20 years. That growth in terms of traffic volumes, average daily traffic volumes on our roadways, you see some slight increases across the board. One thing to notice in 2020, those average daily traffic volumes and just generally vehicle miles traveled really took a dip with the pandemic. And we've seen those numbers start to level out again, come back up. But as growth occurs, how people travel is very fluid, and oftentimes people will choose different routes as say a state route might be improved from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. We might see people shift their route preference as those facilities are improved. So it's a very dynamic situation. Next slide. Thanks, Stephen. So roadway ownership, I think this is kind of us getting at the importance of those partnerships with other agencies within the county. This system really comes together through the effort of lots of different agencies. We're looking at countywide. Boone County is responsible for about 44% of the roadways in Boone County, followed by Columbia with about 25% by center line mileage. So straight down the middle, imagine a line. That's how we're calculating these totals. MoDOT 22%. MoDOT shows up in this map as the dark blue lines, kind of forming the spider web to which we're all connected through those state highways. When we look particularly inside the CATSO, the Columbia Area Transportation Study Area, we see most of Columbia's roads represented there. So they shrink once you get to that countywide perspective. Outside that CATSO boundary, nearly 2/3 of all roadways are owned and maintained by Boone County. So they're responsible for really making sure people get to and from their destinations safely and comfortably. Next slide. We also want to look at pavement conditions, not just surface type, but the pavement rating that is assigned to those roadways. And that's done on a regular basis by all our transportation agencies within the county. The data we're showing here is primarily MoDOT and City of Columbia data. We're working to get in the rest of Boone County's pavement ratings to get a sense of where those improvements are likely to occur in terms of addressing deficient or failed pavement conditions, and really that focus on system maintenance and preservation. If we take care of our roads before they get in bad shape, those costs for maintenance are much, much lower. So it's something that the county really keeps tabs on to make sure that they're investing their dollars in transportation very wisely. Another element that's important to us, and we have readily available data through MoDOT, is traffic safety. And when we look at traffic safety, we're looking at recent crash data across the county to get a better sense of, two things. One, where are there hotspots or crash clusters in a particular area that we may be able to identify some high-level opportunities for improvement. So really kind of geographically focused. And the second thing, we can look at the crash characteristics and divide those between urban and rural areas, really filter through our crash data to better understand the types of crashes that are occurring on different roads. In rural areas, we see a greater number of runoff road crashes, so out of control vehicles off the side of the road, which often are combined with hitting a fixed object, and those kind of blunt impacts can result in severe injury. As you look at our injury table here, when we look at incorporated versus unincorporated, the small red sliver at the bottom represents fatal and serious injury crashes. In our incorporated areas, represents about 3.5% of all crashes. In unincorporated areas, that's closer to 5%. So there's a slight increase, slightly higher percentage of killed and seriously injured crashes when we get into those unincorporated areas. And that gives us a sense of where we might be able to focus our attention in transportation improvements that can come from this planning process.
All right, you're back to Bob. You thought you got rid of me. Few more slides. We'll talk about housing a little bit here to give a little picture of what's going on in the county. And this the top part of this graph is how many, or the percentage of households, that is occupied housing units, are occupied by renters, and the bottom half is by owners. How many are by owners? I think the key thing to look at here is the blue bar, because it points out what's the gap or the difference between renters and owners in the cities within Boone County. And of course, those cities are dominated by Columbia. You get a sense of that we have a pretty high percentage of renters in Columbia, and that certainly affects other places. That tends to be the case where you've got, especially in this case, we've got a lot of young people and students living and younger professionals living in rental housing. That's not an uncommon thing in big, diverse cities like Columbia is. Broadly speaking, 67, two-thirds, maybe a little bit less of American households are owner occupied, the rest renter occupied. And so you can see the differences play out here a little bit throughout the Cole County's got kind of that average, but Columbia kind of messes things up within Boone County. So we have a pretty high, relatively high amount of renters. That's not necessarily the case in the outlying cities or the unincorporated areas, which that's too many graphs to show you. But you get a sense of what's going on regarding the what we need to be working on a housing policy basis for planning. Next slide. This gives you just a picture of what's going on with rents. Just to say what's happening with rents over time since 2000 till the last good data we have, which is for the year 2019. Rents are going up. Yes, I'm shocked, right? The rents have been rising pretty rapidly, all things considered. A little slower recently, generally speaking. Centralia looks like the place to go. Centralia rents have come down a little bit in recent years, but that'll go up when people realize that they'll start with, same with Hallsville. We'll see that, but rents are going up. We see that true with home prices as well. We're going to see some moderation in home prices as interest rates stay high, because in order to sell your house, you're probably going to have to lower the price so that people can afford to buy it, given the higher interest rates on mortgages. That hasn't played out very strongly in the economy yet, but it will in all likelihood. When some of us who own our homes want to sell them for a high price, are going to realize we can't quite get that anymore. But we'll see how that plays out with wage increases and so on. But you get a sense of that. Next slide. A key thing to be looking at and concerned about in any community is homeowners and renters who can't afford to live there. So the U.S. Department of Housing, Urban Development, with the Census Bureau, and among others, calculates the shares of renter households and owner households for basically for every year on a rolling basis that are cost burdened. That means that if you're cost burdened, that means you're spending more than 30% of your household income on rent and utilities, or if you own the house, you're spending more than 30% on your mortgage payments, taxes, and utilities as well, and insurance. So the stuff we normally pay every month to occupy our housing, if you're paying more than 30%, it doesn't leave a whole lot left over for everything else you should be spending on to live a reasonably good quality of life, including taxes, but automobile, travel expenses, food, all that kind of thing. We have a challenge here. Now, this graphic here just deals with the renters. And you're going to see these, if you can read the numbers, and I've got them written down here, the numbers are pretty high in Boone County in terms of renters who are considered cost burdened. And that's primarily in Columbia, other than Sturgeon, which they improved their numbers actually. And let's shift to the next slide, Stephen, because otherwise we'll spend too much time on one. This is for the owners and how many are cost burdened as well. Numbers come down for that. Next slide, I think, is going to show. No, we got it. That's the. Let's go back to the first one. That's the renter slide, because the bottom graphic is the one I really want to look at. Columbia's got a very high percentage of cost burden renters. Well, keep in mind that this is a challenge for many university towns where the universities really dominate the economy, and that's because so many students, college students, and grad students for that matter, are living in rental housing, but they technically don't have a whole lot of income themselves as households. They're relying on other sources, particularly like mom and dad, to pay that rent. You get out of student housing, you move into rental housing, and these things tend to look worse than they probably really are. That said, Columbia's a big city. It has a wide range of incomes and household types. So it has a cost burden challenge, particularly among renters. That is also true for normal market rate kinds of people who occupy housing, lower income households, lower wage jobs, and less advantaged people. But the overall impact for Columbia makes it look a lot worse than it probably really is, because those students, while they don't have income themselves, certainly are supported by family, and eventually will be making good money to move on. Go down to the next one, and we'll real quick deal with the owners. Ownership burdens, cost burden tends to be a lot less in terms of percentages. But nevertheless, we have even homeowners. Of course, the students aren't necessarily going to be homeowners occupying those things, so they tend to be less. People who buy homes tend to really have stronger budgets and incomes to support them. I'll say in both cases, the renters and owners over the 20 years or the 19 years that we're showing here, the numbers have improved. We're still in the thousands of housing units, households that are cost burdened in both categories. The unincorporated area, for example, the unincorporated area, Boone County, among renters for the 2019 numbers, about 1,500 renters are considered cost burdened. These are the kinds of people you want to keep an eye on. Those apartment buildings, however they're renting even single family homes, to see if there's enough money going in them to prevent those units from falling apart, not being maintained well enough, because people will move their money where it's important, and it may not be painting the house or putting that new roof on. In the unincorporated areas for the homeowners, the numbers are about 2,100. So there's 2,100 households out there outside of Columbia, basically, and outside of the cities that, it's the kind of thing that as planners and as policymakers, we want to be aware of that there's could be some housing challenges in terms of housing becoming blighted or becoming lesser quality for the kinds of units we want people to live in. Next slide. And now it's, I think, over to
Jessica.
Jessica.
Because last but not least is natural resources. And I'm Jessica Hardesty Norris. I'm here in Columbia. I work for a company called Biohabitats, and I'm a scientist. And I specialize in natural resource management. So one of the things our company does a lot is conservation planning. which, means figuring out where resources are that you want to protect. And then the other side of that, of course, is if areas that you're not especially concerned with conserving or protecting, they might be more suitable for growth. So a lot of times that same question and the flip side of the coin helps think about where are there opportunities for growth and where are there places that you may need to consider obstacles to any growth in that direction, if growth is inevitable, which it certainly seems to be happening based on Bob's summaries. So one of the things that we do when we're thinking about the natural resources of an area is try to consider them in the framework of ecosystem services. And that can mean the benefits that humans derive from natural resources. So that might mean streams that can handle the water that is in them so that you have lower flood risk, or trees that shade neighborhoods and reduce urban heat island effects. Some of those benefits that people get from natural features are ecosystem services. And that's another aspect of the natural resources of Boone, thinking about what we want to preserve for cultural benefits, recreational benefits, and these other more practical ecosystem services. So this slide has a sort of a general land use or native vegetation, current vegetation overview of Boone County. And the thing I really want to emphasize about it is that you have a completely different template in the northern and northeastern part of the county and the southern, southwestern side of the county. And that difference is really because of soils. Pardon me. Boone County falls right where the very tip of the glaciers extended. And so the northeastern side is a glaciated till as a soil, and the southwestern side is the river hills. It's a very different kind of soil and bedrock conditions. This means that in the northern part of the county, there was the native state before settlement by Europeans was probably open prairie. So this is the extent of tall grass prairie, these big, flat, open plains of not a lot of trees. So a lot of the trees that have come up in the northern third of the county are probably post-agricultural. So once fires were suppressed and bison were no longer roaming around, those forests came on board. The other thing to point out maybe about this slide is that the distribution of that prime farmland and farmland follows some of what I'm saying about the eastern and northeastern side being very different ecotype. And you can see it reflected in those sort of brownish colors of the prime farmland. On the next slide, for the natural resource section, we're going to talk about what everyone's favorite aspect of natural resources usually is: places they get to go, and the places they get to go and fish or hunt or hike or enjoy caves and share part of the natural world with their friends or family. And this is an interesting part of the considerations for the entire map for the entire county of where people have access to these resources, and are they intact enough and connected enough that the things that people enjoy about them can persist through time. So you can see we've got definitely a concentration of parks on the southern half of the county. And that's partly because there's some very sensitive and protection worthy areas or flood prone areas down in that side. Right in the central area where Rockbridge State Park and the Three Fingers area is it's important to note that there is some karst and sinkhole typologies down there where you really have a formation of rock that is can present difficulties for other human uses. So the sinkhole map is part of the existing conditions discoveries that we're going to be putting together for you in the existing conditions report. And the last big sort of high level comment on natural resources in our area is to just think through the orientation and size and health of the watersheds and waterways that we have. The watersheds are really important, obviously, to us for managing water, managing stormwater, providing agricultural water, And we can see on the right that the federal government standards have not been met for the uses of several of the streams in our area. The ones that get a lot of press, I think, are the Little Bonfim and Hinkson Creek are both under 303D impairment categories from the US EPA. And so there's a mandate to clean them up. And there's a concerted effort that's been going on for 2 decades now or more that involves the county and the city of Columbia and Missouri or Mizzou. So those impaired streams are something else to watch out for because there are land use and development practices that can offer a lot of better protection to those streams. And I think that's all we wanted to summarize briefly about natural resources, although you will see them come back in future maps and future exercises on this planning.
Thanks, Jessica. Just to wrap things up, just a couple last slides, just to highlight our upcoming schedule. So as I mentioned, the survey will run through the end of this month and through September 30th. Again, please help spread the word. We'll have our in-person open house again 2 weeks from tonight, Tuesday, September 26th, 4:30 to 7 p.m. at Boone Electric Cooperative, the community room. So again, feel free to stop by anytime between 4:30. We'll be having our first deliverable, the existing condition report. We'll be calling it Discovery Report, late fall. So if you follow us on Facebook or if you signed up for one of the e-newsletters, e-blast, we'll be letting folks know when that report is available to view and download from the website. And then just give you a little bit of a preview in terms of a little bit further away. So our next kind of open house round will be in next spring. So once we get past the first of the year, we'll have more information about specific time frame for that. But kind of look for our next round of open house in spring of next year. So with that, again, just a final reminder, if you don't follow us on Facebook, please do. If you scan the QR code there on the left, it'll take you to our Facebook page. You can follow us on Facebook. So this ends our formal presentation, the formal part of the webinar. We do have some time if folks want to stay on in terms of questions. I'll first kind of go through the questions that we've got from the Q&A chat, and also if you raise your hand, we can also unmute you if you wanted to ask a question by talking. And then again, I also encourage you to, in terms of if you do want to talk to us a little bit more in more detail, you'll feel free to come to the in-person open house in 2 weeks, and you'll have a chance to talk with us one-on-one, members of the team. So let me answer the question again. And thanks everyone for coming tonight and spending your Tuesday evening with us. Just a few things in the Q&A chat before I kind of get to the raised hand. So someone asked a question about how does population look per square mile as Columbia has both expanded geographically and in population. So I don't have that right in front of me. One of the earlier slides we had, it did have the kind of population density. Obviously, Columbia is much denser in terms of population than other parts of the county. So I don't have that information in terms of per square mile right in front of me.
Stephen, if I could pop in, this is Bob. I saw the question, so I did a quick calculation. I don't have historic population per square mile or density in Columbia because Columbia has changed in size over time. But the most recent numbers suggest that it's a population per square mile is about 1,918 or 1920 people per square mile on average for the city of Columbia. That's roughly the same density as the entirety of St. Louis County, a very suburban county. So that's probably roughly about what it is. St. Louis City is in the 4,500 per square mile range, even with all of its population decline. So Columbia is on that scale of a pretty robust suburban community in terms of density. That doesn't mean it's not dense in some, a lot denser in some places and less dense in others. But that's if you get to kind of a scale right now, partial answer to that question. But we'll look up those historic numbers because the city used to be smaller geographically, also smaller with population.
Thank you, Bob, for picking it up in the presentation. And in terms of written questions, there's only written question we had. One other comment written was thanks, a lot of good ground covered, pun intended. Another question just came in. Are there any specific plans or information regarding more and or better broadband services for rural Boone County and or Columbia? We didn't have any information kind of in the presentation today, but we're kind of covering that topic kind of again in our existing conditions report. So thank you for that question. Let me look at in terms of
It's a good point to put in the survey if you go to the survey and fill it out to make sure that that gets attention. We're aware of, you know, issues and bringing them forward in the planning process. But
yeah, it's a good point. Jessica has made that. Yeah, please too. If you bring up a question tonight, make sure you kind of put it in the survey. You haven't filled out the survey, including it in your survey responses. And then right now, I don't see any hands raised. Not sure. We had another question come in. Is there going to be any information gathered on transportation related emissions and how the county can try to reduce, minimize? Kevin, you want to touch on that one in terms of, I know we're looking at kind of changes in volumes. But can you want to touch on that a little bit, Kevin?
Yeah, that's not something we've dug into yet, but I think it's definitely worth looking at. I think while we may not address specifically, you know, emissions from a quantitative perspective, it's something we think about in terms of kind of the broader transportation picture, looking at alternative modes of transportation, how we can support people walking, bicycling, using transit. So I think kind of under that broader umbrella, we're looking at strategies that may contribute to a reduction in transportation related emissions. But I don't think we'll get through this planning process into a level of depth of kind of setting specific numeric targets.
Yeah, I'm glad Kevin kind of brought up the point. That's one thing I kind of touched on a little bit earlier in terms of level of detail. Again, we're looking at a lot of different kind of categories in terms of kind of pulling together information and things like, a lot of times there's more in-depth studies, outside of the outside this master plan, comprehensive plan process. CATSO, the Columbia Area Transportation District Transportation Organization, does a regular transportation master plan of the area of CATSO. So, and then I know the counties are also partnering with Columbia on a kind of a separate housing study. So a lot of times in some of these topics, we'll be looking at things, as Kevin mentioned, kind of qualitatively, but sometimes again, because of the breadth of our work, we can't quite get into some of the levels of numeric detail on every topic. So, the question came in, this may be a question in terms of more from the census, in terms of how they collect numbers for Bob, in terms of is the homeless population factored into the population growth? I don't know in terms of how the census picks up those numbers. Bob, you have any insights on that?
Yeah, the homeless population is counted in the census. So if you've got homeless people, the Census Bureau and the local planners and all that, we make every effort to make sure they're counted as part of the population of a city or other county. How they're handled with housing is another question. If homeless people have housing, they're not homeless anymore. But if they're living in shelters or even in tents or whatever, they tend to be counted as unhoused. or living in group quarters, at least at the time of the count of the census count itself. But yes, all those, if you're a human being and living in Boone County or in the United States, you're counted as a citizen. If that's getting to the question, I didn't.
So I think it's all the questions we, yeah.
Now, that is it counted, is it factored into the population growth? We'd like not to think so. We'd like to make sure the population of homeless is going down. But if they're kind of a share of the population, and they would be, as the population of the cities and counties grow, there might also be a growth in homeless, unless there's major steps to deal with that issue. So yeah, the answer is yeah. We're counting them. They're real people.
And this will be our last question of the evening. So I want to ask: climate change impacts will invariably drive migration from the more vulnerable coast to the center of the country. We consider a significant increased population of Boone County as an affordable and desirable area to live in your plan. So one thing that I didn't really talk too much about in the presentation was kind of the other phases, of the planning process. So the next phase of our work after this fall, after we pull together these conditions. So over the winter and spring, we'll be doing you basically different kind of scenario planning. And again, we can't we can't predict the future per se. If we could predict the future, let's say wouldn't be planners, we'd be placing maybe some large bets. But we will be making some logical maybe some logical scenarios in terms of maybe how different scenarios for population growth and job growth in the county, and then start to look at how those kind of different scenarios could be be addressed from especially some of the core elements of the plan in terms of land use and transportation and related impacts on natural resources, et cetera. So I don't want to kind of get into it, because until we kind of get to that phase of the work, it's a little hard maybe sometimes if folks will wrap their arms around, but that's kind of where we are headed in terms of looking at different scenarios of growth kind of in the next phase of the planning process in the winter and spring. So with that, again, I'm going to wrap things up. Again, we appreciate everyone's time and attending this webinar again on a beautiful late summer, fall evening that you decided to spend your time with us and view this webinar. So enjoy the nice weather the rest of the week. Again, thank you for your time. Again, please encourage others to take the survey. Stay abreast of the website, and follow us on Facebook, and sign up for our newsletters if you haven't already. So again, have a good evening, everyone.